All right, here we are again. We're doing it again. It's still happening. This is like probably 130-ish episodes now. So I'm pretty much a pro at this. Um, yeah, so welcome to the Edlow podcast. We're here with Mary Beth O'Connor. So uh do I call you Judge O'Connor? Do I call you Mary Beth? What do I call you?
Mary Beth is good. Mary Beth is good.
Okay. As an attorney, I'm always very careful about judges who I talk to. Now, so in your career, because you were administrative law judge, correct?
Yes, a
So
federal administrative law judge. Yeah.
yeah. So as an administrative law judge, was there a differentiation between an administrative law judge versus, say, like a civil court judge?
Yeah. So, I mean, different states and federal systems are all built in various ways. And a federal administrative law judge is assigned to a specific agency or appointed to work for a specific agency. And so I worked for the Social Security Administration.
Oh,
And so a
nice.
lot of what I heard were disability cases and other issues, but disability was the big bulk of it.
Got it. It was really fascinating. The closest I think I got to administrative law judge was I had a combo case in my personal injury case, really big case, one of the biggest ones up to that point in my career. It was the biggest case and most complicated case I'd ever dealt with. And there was a work comp component. And it was really funny how the workers' compensation attorney was just deathly afraid of going to trial. So I was like, well, let's do it. And then I got to the work comp board, right, to do the trial. And I could tell that even the judge didn't want to do it. He was like, you guys figure this out. And we ended up settling it right before. It was really interesting. So interesting how different areas of law have different just general practices and culture attached to it.
Yeah, and I mean, I went to law school when I was 39, and then after I went to Berkeley Law, and when I graduated, I worked at a big law firm. I worked at Cooley,
Yeah.
and I practiced complex business litigation and securities litigation primarily. And then I worked for the federal government on general litigation, but I also co-led a number of very large class actions. And so, yeah, state court versus federal court have their differentiators. Different practice areas have their differentiators. Different judges have their differentiators.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of variables in litigation, as you well know.
Yeah, it was actually funny. I was on a panel at UC Davis Law School just this last week, and I was talking to a bunch of first-year law students, and they were asking us questions. And one of the questions came about what is something that something that I wouldn't expect that I have to deal with. And I was like, yeah, I mean, the variations of judges is something because it's different when there was the PJ here. He just retired, Judge Colhane, but the guy was he was an academic. He understood the law. He wanted to understand. He was interested in the law. And I was like, that's just a far cry from somebody who just came in, maybe did family law and is now on the civil bench and he's a 1-year judge. And it's how do you educate that judge without making him feel like you're talking down to him in his own courtroom versus someone like Judge Colhane, who you're like, I'm never going to know as much as he does. You know what I mean? And so it's actually a fun, the strategy of being a lawyer is so fun if you have the mind for it. I love it.
Yeah, and I enjoyed it as well when I did it. And being a judge is a very different type of stressor and a very different dynamic that goes on. I will say, when you ask me what to call me, when I first became an administrative law judge, I was at my office and the phone rang and it was internal. I mean, I could see it was internal, and I answered it like I always did. I said, "Hi, it's Mary Beth," and there was this confused sputtering on the other end of the line, and then I was like, "Oh my gosh, Judge O'Connor," So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's got to be a wild transition. We had an attorney here. One of my mentors here is now a judge for the Sacramento Superior Court, and it's just wild to think, that's got to be. I've talked to him a couple of times, and just weird for him to feel like he's in that position. And so, and the thing that's interesting. So your story, the reason you're here, we have these listeners who are like, oh wow, you have a judge on, but it's not just that you're a judge; it's where you came from. Because you have such an interesting story. That's what we're here about. We're here about human stories, and everybody's got one, but yours is fascinating because you had a real traumatic childhood that resulted in drug use, and you end up becoming a judge, a federal judge, which is very not common. Did you ever run into anybody? Have you ran into anybody else who has a similar story than you?
I read an article once about someone who had a similar history that ended up at Big Law. There was,
Mm,
in the local legal news, but that was really the closest. And
yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a really unusual arc. But I always do emphasize some of the timelines. I mean, so first of all, traumatic childhood. Yeah, started using my first drug, which was alcohol. Very common first drug. In fact, it was Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine, which a lot of people know. But I moved up, weed and pills and acid, and I was shooting meth by 17, and I didn't get sober till 32. So it was a really
Wow.
long haul. But
Yeah.
I got sober at 32. I didn't go to law school until I had 6.5 years sober, and I was appointed a federal judge when I had 20 years sober. So these are very long time frames. I did not get sober thinking one day I'll be a judge. When
Yeah.
I got sober, my professional goal was let's not get fired again. Like that was
Right.
really the extent of my professional goals.
Right. And that's the thing. I think that's really important to highlight right out the gate. We'll go through your story, but this type of stuff, success, in my view, even though long-term success is really a game of inches. You know what I mean?
Yes,
Like,
yes.
because if you're thinking of the end goal, like I can tell you my story is not even nearly as dramatic as yours, but I did have to work all the way through college.
Mhm.
There wasn't a lot of no financial backing as I was going through it. So went to evening school. And when you're looking at, 9 years of school to get through, just to get to the starting line of an attorney practice, that can be daunting. But if you're looking at it semester to semester, let's just get through this semester. Let's just get through this week. That's where success really comes, is in that game of inches.
Well, and I talk about that with especially newbies in recovery about the incremental nature of progress. I mean, first of all, for someone new in recovery, there's those factors, but there's also the fact that they don't really actually know who they are. And they don't
Mm,
know what they're going to want in a year or two when they have some sober time underneath them and they have a chance to reconnect to their sort of their true inner self, to what their real goals are, to what their emotions are. So I really sort of discourage newcomers in recovery from worrying about their 5-year plan because,
sure.
they don't even know what they're going to want a year or two from now. And I do talk to them a lot about it should really be about what are my priorities right now and what's my first goal in each of those priorities. What's my first plan in each of those priorities? Let me achieve that and then set the second goal and the second plan. And, it's amazing how far you can get if you tackle life that way.
Yeah, man. That's so true. And it's especially with what you're saying with addiction. I remember, so I've been very open here on my podcast about my father, who is long time recovered drug addict, over 25 years now. And he got sober. I can't remember if I was 17 or 18. I think I was 17 when he finally got through with rehab and never went back. Um, but one of the things that I had to learn was I was essentially, I think he started, playing with drugs, and he had a checker, like he would be good for a while and relapse and good for a while and relapse. And so, but I mean, I think it was like 14, 15. And so it's like, here I am 17 being raised by someone with the maturity of a 15, 16-year-old, right? Because you kind of, when it comes to addiction and even trauma in some ways, the way I've understood it is you're kind of stuck at that age where it happened, where it started.
Well, I mean, certainly when I got sober, I didn't have a lot of skills that I would have had I not been, enmeshed in my drug use for all those years, right? I mean, I
Sure.
had terrible interpersonal skills, for example. I could be really aggressive. I could be triggered really easily. There were just a lot of things that I would have learned or experienced or had practice in that I didn't. And so it does take a while in sobriety to really be able to build up not just your skills for staying sober, but your skills for dealing with the world, especially dealing with situations where you're feeling emotional, because you're
Mm.
also not used to dealing with your true feelings when you're covering it up with drugs. I mean, in my drug use, I would feel rage. I would feel, heightened emotions, but I wasn't used to having to harness them I didn't have the range of emotion that I had once I got sober.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know what they were at first. When I first went to therapy, when I got home from rehab, my therapist would ask me questions like, well, what did you feel about that? And I would look very confused. And so she handed me a laminated card with a feelings list on it so that I could try to figure out what my emotions were. So there's all those things going on in early recovery. And you're right. You're not really where you would have been at that age had you not had all those years spent in your addiction.
Yeah, and it's funny when you started talking, you're like, boy, I didn't know how to handle my emotions. I get really angry and I get really triggered really fast. I'm like, you sound like every attorney I know. I was like, we're all bred that way. That's funny. Well, so going back, let's talk about really where it started, because I think a lot of people who have addiction issues, they're really coping mechanisms for another problem, right? And so let's talk about I know that you've referenced you had childhood trauma. Let's start there. What was it about your childhood that was so traumatic?
I mean, it started really with my mother not being bonded or connected to me. So she wasn't really focused on me or interested in me. And she could be violent, but when I was 9, she married my stepfather, and he was very violent with her. He was physically, sexually violent with me. And it was just that I just never knew what was going to trigger him. You're walking on eggshells. Things could be fine for 2 weeks. And then suddenly there's, out of the blue, you do something you might have done 15 times before and got no reaction. And now there's this, escalated aggressive reaction. And so it was a really high stress environment. And I really felt I had a lot of anxiety symptoms. I had some OCD-like tendencies. And that was really especially starting when I was 9.
Wow. So now do you looking back now, just curious, and this is interesting. This is going to be an interesting conversation, I think, because, man, when somebody, like, for example, with my dad, it took me a long time to kind of get over the stuff that went down. And I'm sure that you probably still haven't, or maybe you have gotten over the stuff that happened with your stepfather. Have you ever taken a little bit and wondered why that was happening for him? Like, why he was so all of a sudden just kind of would snap out of the blue? Did you ever kind of know what was going on there?
I mean, the neighbors would tell us things about him that, a couple things. One is that his mother had abandoned him when he was a child, but also he had been in Vietnam. And they said that before he left, he had some of, he was aggressive and a little bit, violent, but that when he came back, he was much, much worse. But I will say that my child self didn't care why, right?
Sure.
I only cared about is there anything I can do to reduce my risk? And not just my risk, but I was the oldest sibling. And so I felt a real responsibility to try to, help my brother, not my brother as much, but my sister, avoid getting his negative attention. If he was focused on her, I'd distract. But I also taught my sister techniques to try to reduce the odds of his violence. I couldn't stop it, but sometimes I could reduce it. Like, I taught her that when we emptied the dishwasher, we had to, as a chore, empty the dishes out of the dishwasher. I taught my sister, put the dishes away one dish at a time so they don't clack. Like, it was sort of that level of strain, but also just as a little girl trying to figure out what can I do here to at least avoid some of the violence.
Man, so that's like just clacking the the dishes. I mean, it's fascinating how irrational some people can be,
Yes.
But obviously, when you're a kid, you're not, like you said, you're not concerned with why it's happening as much as let's stop it from happening, right? And so as you grew older, looking back, what were some of the symptoms you were experiencing? You mentioned a few of them: OCD, anxiety. Were those situational, or was it like constant?
So on the OCD side, I had some repetitive habits. Like, I had to think about odd numbers. I liked like syllables to come out odd. I used to have a comb, a hairbrush, and a mirror. And when I was at my dresser and I would be using them, I had to put them down in a certain order. If I didn't put them down in the right order, I believed something horrible was going to happen to my baby brother. And so
Wow.
sometimes I would put them down and I'd freeze and I'd realize, oh my gosh, I don't know if I did it right. Like if I do it right
Mm.
now, is that going to make up for the fact that I didn't do it right before? So there were those kind of OCD-like tendencies, but also I was, significantly depressed at times, but mostly I was just in a state of constant high anxiety.
Sure, sure, I can imagine. So now you were 12 years old when you first drank alcohol, and
Yeah.
you're just so you know, you're talking to a guy who, because of my father's experience, I have stayed away from everything. I mean, there's a religious reason for that as well, but at the same time, like I don't think I would ever touch it just because I have that gene throughout my entire family. And so but for someone who the first time you drink it, especially at that age, what was it like? And let me ask you, where did you get it? You're 12.
My girlfriend stole it from her sister, and she rode all over on her banana seat bicycle with the Boone's Farm in the basket on her bike, and we actually drank it out of Flintstones glasses that used to have grape jelly in them. Like that was the level of our sophistication.
Wow, wow. So what was it like when you were drinking it?
What I noticed was how much better I felt. I really felt like I could sort of like almost like I was getting looser, like my
Mm,
shoulders felt more relaxed and I felt like I could take a deeper breath. And I was just giggling in a more sort of true joyful way, having a good time. I felt lighter, and that really did capture my attention. Like, oh my gosh, like this is great. I
yeah.
need more of this. And so I started pursuing alcohol right away. And I would even steal beer from my dangerous stepfather because that's how much I wanted the alcohol. So
Wow.
I was immediately making more opportunities to get more alcohol.
Wow. So uh at this point, I mean, how often are you drinking?
Probably 1 to 3 times a week, at
Mm,
that point. But then it would escalate. But then I also started adding other things in pretty quickly. I mean, I added in weed, by the time I was 13. Then maybe 6 months later, there was pills going around, some downers, some uppers. And then my sophomore year of high school, I did a lot of acid.
mm,
And then when I was 16, I found what became my drug of choice, which was methamphetamine. So it was a
wow.
fairly quick progression. And I was using regularly. I mean, definitely every Friday, Saturday, most Sundays, and sometimes during the week by the time I found meth.
Now, as you're doing this as a teenager, um, are people noticing?
Well, I was, in the druggy crowd at that point, right? I mean, you pick
Mhm,
your
mhm.
people, right?
Sure, sure,
They were
sure.
my people.
Uh-huh.
I still did really well at school. School had always been my one positive experience in my life. I got a
Mhm,
lot of positive attention at school. I did really well.
mhm.
I was always sort of singled out, for special opportunities in school. And I continued to do well until the meth got bad in my senior year of high school. So no one thought, I mean, I was using on the higher end, but it wasn't completely out of control. But by the time I was using meth and shooting up meth, then people started getting concerned. Like other druggies who were also doing the same drugs were telling me that I was overdoing it. Like Mary Beth,
Wow.
you need to go home and go to bed. Like you're out of
Yeah.
control.
Wow. And how are you responding when you're hearing that from your friends? Are you like, I can quit
Yeah.
whenever I want, or are you
I would lie because if I wanted to get access to meth and, if I hadn't seen someone in a few days, I'd say, oh yeah, I just took a week break, and so then they'd go, oh
uh-huh.
great, let's get high, And so
Right.
I would
Wow.
do what I had to do to sort of tamper down their concern without actually changing my behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's a hallmark, that's a hallmark of addiction is the lying aspect of it. There's you start justifying and rationalizing, compartmentalizing, things like that. And how are you as you're doing this, like, do you feel better about yourself, worse about yourself as you're getting through all this?
I mean, it wasn't the drugs that made me feel bad about myself. I mean, meth is a sort of an up and down drug. We think about it as
Mhm.
like it's got this beautiful high, which it
Mhm.
does in the beginning. I
Mhm.
mean, all of them are really good in the beginning, right? But
Mhm.
but when you stay up for 3 days on a regular basis, then you have the really hard crash. And
Yeah.
I actually like the crash side of meth as well as the high side, because when I crashed, I slept in this like deep sleep of nothingness. In other words, I wasn't having nightmares. I wasn't tossing and
Mm,
turning. I was just like in this black, dense
mm,
sleep. And I like that. But the things that
yeah.
became problematic were things
Mhm.
more along other behaviors, like had sex with too many people, and sometimes I would get in arguments with friends because I was tweaking out on the meth, or they were, and so relationships could be troubling. So I wasn't feeling bad about the drug use, but sometimes there were other things going on that I wasn't always happy with my own behavior.
Yeah, sure. And as this is going on, so your stepfather, was he still in your life throughout high school?
Yeah, my mother left him my freshman year of college. So
Okay.
a little
Okay.
late for me. Yeah, she left him a
Yeah.
little late for me.
Okay. So how is your family are they noticing this change? Are they commenting on it?
They didn't say anything, and I think and first, it just seemed like, well, she's probably just drinking and doing. I can't imagine they didn't know that I was using some drugs. That's really hard for me to imagine. But they didn't
Mhm.
say anything, and I think partly, even when it started to get bad, I didn't go home sometimes for days. And my sister and I lived in the apartment over the garage, so I was sort of able to hide a bit how much I was actually not home. But they weren't
Mhm.
paying attention. They never really paid attention. I wasn't
Mhm.
really it wasn't like you had a normal mother who's wondering, I wonder where my daughter is. No,
Yeah.
it wasn't like that at all. And I don't think, even if they noticed, I don't think my mother would have wanted to invest the effort it would have taken to deal with it. I think it was just easier to ignore.
Mhm. Um, Kind of jumping ahead a bit, I'm sure there was some trauma related to that. Did you ever kind of make amends with your mom and kind of uh, get back in that relationship, or was it one where you kind of had to just step away?
I mean, amends wouldn't be the right word with her. She did things to me way more than I did things to her. If
Well, that
anybody
I think yeah, I think what I meant was there a time where you kind of were able to like put that stuff away and just kind of say, hey, like let's reconnect our relationship.
So when I got sober, she started trying to become more involved in my life again. Also, when I was sober, I was successful, right? And so I
Yeah.
started moving up the corporate ladder, and I went to law school, and these things made her more interested in me. It reflected well on her, but the problem for me wasn't what she had done when I was a child, and again, it wouldn't have been reconnect with her. It would have been connect for the first time, because she
Yeah.
never was connected with me.
Mhm.
But it wasn't that I was holding a grudge from childhood. It was that she kept doing things. She
Mm,
kept, her behavior didn't change, and she kept
yeah.
trying to drag me into chaos, and she kept trying to, making financial demands and my time demands and berating me. She beat me. I was driving her in a car at 50 miles an hour down an expressway in Arizona when I was like 3 years sober. And I said something she didn't like, and she was pulling my hair out and beating me on the head as I was driving. And
Wow.
so at that point it was really okay. um I need to emotionally disengage from this person, because she's not
Yeah.
safe. At the same
Mm,
time, I maintained a civil relationship with her, in part because she had custody of my nieces and nephew, and I wanted access to them. So I
mm,
did the emotional work necessary that I could engage with her and not react myself, not get
yeah.
sucked down with her. And that allowed us to have sort of a superficial civil relationship.
How did you do that? Because I gotta tell you, as someone who has dealt with, I think if I'm doing my own self-assessment, I have a hard time, especially with people who betrayed me. I have a hard time letting go of that and accepting, because I think with some of these people, it sounds like your mom might have had, some mental health issues of her own. And it sound a lot of the times those people are so self-indulged and so kind of narcissistic, for lack of a better term, that it's it's hard for me, it's really hard to like not, especially as a lawyer, to like not try to give them the aha moment and be like, do you realize how jacked up you are? You know what I mean? Like, do you realize how much you're hurting everybody? And to have a relationship where I accept, like, you know what, I just have to lower my expectations and just expect that this person is going to do whatever. And if I want to have a different, how did you do that?
Well, the first thing was that when I first got sober, if she would get, escalate and start to verbally attack me and get aggressive, I would respond the same way. And
Yeah.
so I was responding like that. And then at some point I realized, wait a minute, I don't want to behave like this. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to do it. And so I had to figure out how to not react. And a lot of it was that when after rehab, I did a lot of therapy. I mean, not only did I have the child abuse, but I had a kidnapping and rape by 3 men that lasted
Oh,
6 hours, and I had a violent boyfriend. I had an extensive trauma history. So I
wow.
was in therapy for a long time, and I worked through some of this in therapy, but also talking about the incremental improvement. What really happened in a practical sense was, at first, I could do a lot better with her sort of in a calm environment. But if she if she increased the emotional intensity, I would still have trouble staying, calm. But
Yeah.
over time, with practice, and also with sort of emotionally disengaging from her, I was able to handle her no matter what she did. Like, I remember when
Mm.
I had maybe 5 or 6 years sober, and she was screaming at me that I was a junkie whore or something, and I realized that has no impact on me whatsoever. Like, I am having no emotional reaction. This is beautiful. Like, it was
Yeah.
a great place to be. But you're right. It was a lot of effort and a lot of work, but I wanted to have a relationship with my nieces and nephew. And so I needed to get to a place where I could interact with her in a productive way that wasn't causing me to sort of regress.
Yeah, that it takes a lot of self-control and that emotional, that emotional disengagement. Is it a situation, doing that, is it like a situation where you're just kind of rolling your eyes and being like, none of this is true, not accepting what they're saying is true? Or, what do you do to disengage? What did you say to yourself?
I mean, at first it was just saying, I'm not going to let her, I'm not going to let her upset me. I'm not going to let her push my buttons. I'm going to stay calm. But later it was, I honestly didn't care what she said. Like,
Yeah.
I just didn't care. She could have said anything to me and yelled whatever, and I really didn't care anymore. And so it was a true emotional separation.
Yeah.
And that was really helpful to me. In fact, it was when she died, and she died about almost 10 years ago. My
Mm.
friends kept telling me, when your mom dies, you're actually going to have a bigger reaction than you're expecting.
Mm.
And look, I was there. She was in hospice the last week. I went to her in Arizona. I made sure she got everything she needed. I did my daughterly responsibilities, and I
Mhm.
felt bad that she died because she was only 72, but I did
Mhm.
not grieve it. I had
Mhm.
already grieved it. I had already grieved actually what I never had. I had already
Yeah.
let go of that need. And so
Mhm.
I didn't have that process because I really had completely eliminated any expectations that we were going to have a different relationship. And I didn't have an emotional bond to her anymore.
Wow, that's interesting and impressive. That you could do that. Going back now, and you threw in some nuggets there that I'm like, wow, that's serious. Having situations like a kidnapping and a rape and all of that stuff. And is this all going on while you're still, you're still on drugs at the time, right? It's all connected.
I'm shooting meth in high school. When I came to college, I grew up in Central Jersey, and I came to California for college. I graduated from Berkeley. So the first 3.5 years of college, I actually did do better with my drug use. I
Mm.
mostly used alcohol, sometimes cocaine, which was new to me, sometimes pills, sometimes hallucinogens, mostly on the weekends. Sometimes it rolled in the week.
Mhm.
But I had that kidnapping and rape when I was in college. And then about a year later, I moved in with a violent boyfriend. And so I just sort of like lost the little bit of grip I had. And in
Mm.
January of my senior year of college, I started using meth again on a regular basis. And I didn't get sober until I was 32. So that's sort of
Wow.
how it all played out.
So at that age, were you 22, 23 when that was kind of coming along? Wow.
Yes.
And so this situation, because you hear about this on college campuses, and I'm not sure how strong it is, how prevalent it seems like. There's a lot more awareness to what they would call rape culture on college campuses. First of all, I got to say, super impressive that as someone who is heavily using drugs in high school gets into Berkeley. That's pretty impressive, right? I mean, you're obviously a very smart person. But in this situation, could you possibly talk about, because I'm sure that kind of caused a bit of a relapse, those two things together. For maybe somebody, because I know there are some people who are listening that I use the word rape culture and they're like, that's not a real thing, or maybe don't understand the serious impact of something like that on somebody. Could you kind of explain what that does to somebody when you're completely powerless like that?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that in college, in particular, most of my friends that suffered sexual assaults, it was what we would call date rape, right? It was
Mhm.
somebody that they sort of knew somewhat. I mean, it wasn't a stranger. It was someone that they maybe have gone out with 2 or 3 times, and then they are assaulted, and that it creates a lot of sort of distrust of your own judgment. But it's also questioning, you second guess yourself. Why was I alone with him? Why did I go here? Why did I, have a drink? And society certainly will judge women that way. What were you wearing and how many drinks did you have and things.
Yeah.
That kidnapping and rape was actually off of the street. Like, I was waiting at a bus stop, and they offered me a ride, and I was an idiot, and I took the ride, and I didn't even know there were 3 people in the van. I thought there were 2, but somebody was hiding in the back. And so he, sort of tackled me down, and they drove off. And I mean, I was confident, okay, this is it. Now I'm going to die. But on
Mm.
the other hand, in a way, my trauma history gave me some advantages, because I was able to stay calm, and I was able to interact with them in sort of a neutral way. Or,
Mm.
I was watching them to see sort of what their personalities were and how they interacted, like who was in charge here, and I was very consciously watching their behaviors, their interactions, their words, and to understand what was going on, and just to try to increase my odds of success. And I will say, when I see, like, on television, when there are somebody's, kidnapped, or they're out in the woods or in a house in the middle of nowhere, and they're screaming their head off. I mean, that's television, right? In real life, that's not a good strategy. It's
Right.
much better to try to not trigger them, not escalate the emotional intensity of it. And so I was cooperative, and I was friendly, and I, did what I could, because I thought that's what I needed to do to try to have some chance of survival. And finally, in the end, they did let me go.
Wow. So hard to predict, obviously, but do you, based on what you observed, first of all, it's surprising that you remember I wonder if it's your trauma history that makes it, because so you hear so many people in these traumatic experiences that they lose memory, they're not thinking clearly, there's things that they don't remember, right? Because it's a traumatic experience. Since you've had that trauma, perhaps that's how were emotionally cognizant enough to check out details like that. And so, do you think the way you acted that helped you survive? Did you get a vibe that they would have killed you if you didn't do something like that?
I was definitely afraid for my life at multiple points, in particular, one of the three. I really, my assessment was, it was one particular one of the three was the threat to my life. He was the one
Mm.
who was going to make the decision. He was the one who was dangerous. And so I was often worried, but I wasn't for 6 hours. It's not like I was constantly worried for my life, but I was worried in the very beginning. I was worried at different points through, and I was threatened. I mean, I was, threatened with it. But then also at the end, when they said they were going to let me go and drop me off, then I was worried again, because that seemed, unlikely. And so it was really an emotional roller coaster, but it was an internal emotional roller coaster, right? It wasn't an
Right,
external emotional roller coaster.
right. So, what was the end result of that? Did you report it to the police, and what happened?
So they actually took me back to where they had picked me up when I was trying to go to my friend's house. They dropped me in front of my friend's apartment, which is where I was originally going. And it was a van. It's one of those 70s vans with those big doors on the side. You know what I mean? And so they opened the door and told me that I, go. And I sort of jumped onto the ground, and in my mind, I'm saying license plate, but my body's like, go, 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 go. And so I just ran, and I could not bring myself to look backward. I just ran into the apartment and up to my friends. And so I never reported it. I felt like I didn't have enough information, and to be honest, I didn't trust the police. I mean, my experience with the police when they came for my stepfather being abusive was that they were no help at all, and so I didn't have a great deal of trust. And I also thought, well, I mean, I was bruised, but I wasn't really beat up. I did drugs with them because they offered them to me. I didn't trust the police to believe me, and I didn't even have a license plate. And so I never reported it.
And what years was this?
That happened in 1981.
Wow. So, I mean, yeah, back in that time frame, kind of, because there's people who listen to this and go, that happened to you and you didn't report it. Like, are you kidding? You wouldn't report it. Explain the rationale why, because you hear that a lot, right? You hear a lot of women who, especially more in the context of the date rape situation, probably more than in your situation even. But I mean, in these situations, why, what is the worry about reporting?
I mean, rape is the most underreported crime, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's because we know what happens to women who charge rape. Often they're the ones who are attacked. Their reputation is on the line. They're harangued. They're attacked if they get to be a witness. But also, there's a very low arrest and conviction rate for rape. And so, probably it's going to be useless. But also in the immediate time, you're in a heightened emotional state, and you're not exactly always thinking clearly, which is why sometimes people report the rape 2 or 3 days later when they've sort of had time to calm down and talk to their friends or talk to their rape crisis hotline or whatever it was. But for me, I didn't think that without the license plate, they were never going to find them anyway. I mean, it had a vague description of a van and 3 guys, and I really didn't trust the police to do anything about it based on what I had seen happen. So it's easy to criticize, but it's a very difficult decision for people to make whether or not they're going to report.
And that is what I think is hard. I mean, I can only speak to my experience. I mean, like, for example, juries, right? With preemptory challenges and things like that. Like what I do, I tell my clients sometimes when I'm talking about biases, right? I go, listen, if you have a neck problem, anyone who comes in on that jury that's got a neck problem, the defense is going to kick them off the jury.
Yeah.
So you're going to have 12 people there who don't know what it's like to have that type of neck problem. And if they don't understand that the human reaction sometimes is to not go to the doctor because they're so busy with life, and a month turns into 3. And then they go, well, if it was really that bad, they would have gone to the doctor. And I think that's the same thing when you're dealing with rape, especially for a guy. It's really hard, I think, personally, for men to understand what a woman goes through in these types of situations. I've recently feel like I've had some conversations where I'm starting to kind of understand. Like, for example, that situation, you're standing on the side of the road and a van comes up and asks you for a ride. Okay. I'm 6'7", 295 pounds. Okay. Like, nobody is going to try to kidnap me. I've never once walked down the street, even like here in Sacramento. If you're walking downtown, there's homeless people and mentally ill people everywhere. I am never afraid of for my physical well-being. That is a different experience than a woman in a dress. You know what I mean? And so I think it's hard sometimes for especially guys to understand, especially guys who are generally more aggressive, who think, boy, if someone attacked me, I'd be fighting for my life, to not understand the power dynamics. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and a couple things. I mean, getting in the van, it's interesting because with my trauma history, on one hand, I can really be hyper reactive to threat. Like, if somebody came out of the corner of my eye, even today, I can't have somebody standing like right behind me in that way. It stresses me out. On the other hand, there were some threats I didn't recognize, and I didn't recognize this threat. The guys, they went around like a couple times laughing and joking with me, you know what I mean? And I didn't recognize the threat, but I'm in a closed environment with 3 men. And also they told me that they had a gun. They stuck something in my back that they said was a gun, but I never got a clear look at it. And so I was never sure, but it didn't matter because there were 3 of them and there was just me. And so there was no realistic chance of getting away. Now I will say there was a time that the hardest part of that for me was they actually had to stop to get gas. Because they were driving me pretty far away. Like they drove me like, I don't know, an hour away. And so when they stopped to get gas, one of them was in the van with me, threatening me, and the other 2 were out. And I could hear people outside. And I thought about it. Can I get out? Can I at least open the door enough and scream? But I knew that door. It was a van I was familiar with from my hometown. Guys had these vans that had that big L-shaped silver handle that you had to ka-chunk and pull it, you know what I mean, to the right. It was a heavy door.
Like an old Astro van type of thing. Like one of those.
It was, and I knew how much effort that would take and where he was sitting, but I really debated with myself, of course, again, silently, can I get away? Should I try? What if I don't try? If I try and I fail, he's going to be angrier if I don't try. And I debated it. And finally I decided there's no realistic chance I'm getting out of here. I'm just going to get him upset. But that decision haunted me for like 20 years. Did I make the right choice? Could I have gotten away? And when I wrote the book, and I really sort of immersed myself into the details of the events again and really put myself back in that van, I recognized 2 things. One is that the Mary Beth in that moment understood the nuances and the dynamics and all of that much better than I could ever understand it again. But also realistically, I was not going to get that door open. Like I just wasn't. But it's hard. It was hard for me to let go of that. We often second guess our choices in situations like that, and they can really hang around for a long time.
They absolutely can. Man, that's rough, especially considering your trauma history. That's a rough go, and then right into moving in with a violent boyfriend. What's interesting is it's almost like, I think there's some even studies that show that that somehow, some way, violent people find the right victims all the time. Like they're almost drawn to them.
Well, it's also that when you have a trauma history, you're more likely to have additional future traumas. I mean, when I moved in with my violent boyfriend, I already knew he was violent before I moved in with him. But he grew up in a violent household. So we sort of had like a trauma bond amongst, me and him. And when I say he was violent, he was a couple times a bit violent before I moved in with him. But like he gave me a bloody nose one time. So, there was.
That's a bit violent. Yeah.
But in my world, it's sort of like a medium level, So.
I gotta say, that's just so funny. That shows the level of trauma you have when you're like, yeah, he gave me a bloody nose. He was a bit violent. And I'm over here and I'm like, yeah, that's a bit violent. Yeah.
But to me, there was a trauma bond. There was a recognition, like we understood each other in that way, in a way that sort of other people who hadn't had that childhood experience couldn't. And also I was used to that sort of heightened emotional intensity of having things be escalating and, calm and then kaboom. I mean, that was how I grew up. That felt normal to me. And so I didn't evaluate it in the way that someone without that history would evaluate it. To me, it was, he's not as bad as what I grew up with, we understand each other. And also just that chaos was sort of attractive. In fact, with my husband, who's a sort of a mellow guy, it took me a long time to really appreciate his offering of like calm love. It took me a while to understand it. I used to try to push him to like react because if he didn't react, then he didn't really love me. And it took years for me to really be able to fully absorb the beauty of what he was offering me.
it's actually kind of funny how like so if you're in a situation with uh, a quote unquote crazy partner, or a crazy situation, and then you get out of that, and then you get into a situation with a normal person, you're now the crazy one. You know what I mean? Because you are used to that, and you're like, why are you not doing that? And you're always second guessing, like, well, wait a minute, what's your play here? What's your play here? Why are you being so nice to me? Like, why are you listening to me? What are you trying to do here? It's so wild how trauma can affect people. So now you're going through those things, and then you get back into you start getting back into shooting up meth, but you graduate, right? You graduate from Berkeley?
Yeah, because I didn't really start going heavy on meth again until January of my senior year.
So
And
like
so,
halfway through, yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Oh wow. So you get through, and then what was your degree in?
History.
Oh, okay. And then what did you do with that?
So I went to Berkeley Law directly out of college, but
Oh.
by the time I got there in the fall, because I had started using meth again on a daily basis in January, I was in no shape to do it. So
Mm,
I went for a while, but then I realized I'm gonna fail out of here. I mean, I was missing, sometimes I missed like 3 weeks of school. I couldn't get there. I couldn't concentrate. And so I withdrew. I gave back a top 10 law school because of my addiction. And I knew that
wow.
was why. And it was like an
Wow.
agonizing, painful loss for me. But it was really, realistically, that was the only choice that I had, if I was unless I was going to stop.
Yeah, and you weren't going to stop at that point.
Not at that
Yeah,
point.
right. So tell me now. So that's you are 23. You don't stop till you're 32.
Yes.
22, 23. So now what's the next tell us what the next 10 years is like for you.
Well, professionally, my term is I worked my way down the corporate ladder.
Yeah. So where'd you start? Where'd you start like
um,
working?
I worked sort of in different companies in sort of mid-level, administrative management type positions. But
Mhm.
but every job I had was less money and less responsibility, and I held it for less time. So, but my last job before I went to rehab was word processing. Like that's what I had worked my way down to.
Wow. Wow.
But that was just the professional side, right? I mean, by 32, I was having physical problems. Meth is very toxic. I did it for a very long time. I was really sort of just emotionally debilitated. I was feeling like trapped in such a horrible, miserable small box. And then my partner was ready to throw me out. And so it was sort
Mhm.
of everything in combination that made me finally say, well, what if I go to rehab?
Yeah, yeah. So now as you're going through this, I mean, uh, probably an expensive habit, right? And you're not able to keep jobs. How are you maintaining all of this?
Well, I would work, maybe for 9 months to a year, but and then they'd lay me off. Although I was really fired, but they always laid me off, so I collect unemployment. But also, you're in part of a culture, right? I had a lot of friends who were, dealing meth, and I could get drugs for free or wholesale, and so and meth it's not cocaine or some other
Mhm.
very expensive drugs, right? So, access to meth was never a problem.
Wow. Man, so as you're doing this, how are the way I've heard it described, um, is, when you first start doing drugs, you're getting these great highs, but as
Yes.
you go, the highs get lower and lower, and soon you're just doing it to have a regular day. Uh, or so I had one guy on
Mhm.
here, a mental health professional who deals with addiction, where he says, now it's just a compulsion. You don't even want to do it. You're just doing it because that's the compulsion. Your brain tells you you need it. Um, was that your experience as you were moving down?
Yes. I mean, in the beginning and also in the second beginning, right? In the first beginning and the second, yeah, for a while, it's an intense, amazing high. But 2 years later, and for the next eight, it's not anymore. I mean, it's just a vicious cycle. You're just doing it to try to get to normal, first of all, if I wanted to try to go to work, I had to do it because otherwise I was going to crash. And it was just to try to keep the emotions at bay, to try to keep the numbness going, to try to just keep moving forward. But it's like, being in a circle that the rats run, it's like that. And there were times where I really felt like, I remember looking in the mirror saying, you're poisoning yourself. And then there were really, ultimately, I didn't see a way out. I mean, I really believed that I had three choices. I could commit suicide, or I could, I'd have some kind of a psychotic break and end up institutionalized, or I could use drugs. I felt like my pain was so deep and so vast that these were my only choices. I was wrong, but that was my perception of it at the time.
So when you're talking about these things that you're going to have a psychotic break, is it because of the addiction or because of the traumas that you were feeling that you were masking with the drugs?
Because of the traumas, because of all the pain. Yeah. Because I mean, what drugs do is they help you tamp down, the real pain, tamp down what's really going on. That's why there's such a high relationship between trauma and substance use disorder. I'm sure you've heard of the adverse childhood experiences score, where you take, a list of 10 questions on adverse. If you score 4, your odds of developing a substance use disorder are 3 to 4 times the general population. And I scored 7 on that test.
Wow.
And so there's a very high correlation. Another way to look at it is, depending on the study, 55 to 75% of the people that have a substance use disorder have a trauma history. So there's a very strong correlation.
So what was it that finally kind of was your rock bottom moment?
Yeah, well, first, we don't, we can talk in a second about, we don't encourage waiting for rock bottom like that, let's not wait that one. But,
sure.
For me, it was that combination of everything hitting, everything together. I was been doing it for a very long time. My body was worn down physically. I was worn down emotionally. I couldn't hold a job. My partner's throwing me out. I'm miserable. I mean, being in the midst of an active substance use disorder is not a happy place to be. It's a miserable place to be. And I was just worn out, and so it was really all of those things together that made me finally say, well, maybe I ought to go to rehab.
So it's funny because it's just when you're in the midst of, I would even say when you're in the midst of trauma, it's the same way. It's like someone who isn't involved in it. They look at you and they're like, I don't understand. And it's like, it's not rational. You know what I mean? You're like the frog in the boiling water, and the water's just gotten too hot. You finally realize, okay, I'm boiling and you need to get out, right?
It's not rational in one sense, but it is in the other. I mean, when I found drugs relieved my pain, right? If they wouldn't have worked in the beginning, I wouldn't have kept pursuing it. I mean, the reason I pursued it is because it seemed rational at the time, because it helped me feel better. It helped me get my emotions under better control and sort of more distant from them, sort of put them further deeper down. And so it's rational in that sense, but it's irrational in the sense that it's not actually resolving the underlying issues. And in fact, it's creating more problems that you wouldn't have if you were sober, so it's not rational in that way.
Sure. Now, going to rehab, how long and how was the experience?
So I did go into a longer term women's program. It was a 90-day minimum program. And there were a couple things about it. One was that in my mind, I was going in for medical treatment. Like, that's what I'm going to go, medical treatment. And when I got there, I found out on the first day that they were exclusively and adamantly exclusively a 12-step house. And 12 steps, of course, is Alcoholics Anonymous, the Narcotics Anonymous, and all of the Anonymouses. And 12 steps are a good fit for a significant proportion of people with a substance use disorder, but not a good fit for everybody. And they were not a good fit for me at all. And so I was very shocked to find that that's what they were offering me. And they were insisting it was the one and only way. Like, they told me repeatedly, this is all there is, do this or you will fail. And they kept telling me, I'd raise questions, about things that weren't a good fit for me, and they would batter me back. You have to do it. It's the only way. You're going to fail. You're going to fail. Your self will run amok. Your best thinking got you here. All these sort of responses to trying to get me to just comply. And that was a real surprise and a real dilemma.
Mm. So what was it about the 12-step programs that didn't work for you?
So I'm atheist. I don't believe in a higher power. Although we can talk about, there's not really a hard line in the programs between people who have faith and don't, but we can talk about that in a second. But for me, I don't believe in a higher power. But also you have to turn over your will and your life to that higher power, which I wasn't going to do. It's not consistent with my worldview. There's a lot of focus on defects in 12 steps, and also you have to agree you're powerless. And so just for those reasons alone, I mean, those were the biggest of the reasons. It just wasn't the right fit. It wasn't something I was comfortable with. And the real problem was that they didn't try to find an option for me. They just told me, do it this way or you're going to fail. This is the only way. And I was paying them. I thought they were the experts. And so at first I believed them that, well, if they're telling me it's the only way, it must really be the only way, And so I had to decide what to do. I mean, literally like on the first day, what am I going to do? And so I did decide to just sort of keep my mind and my ears open and look for the parts I could use and like ignore everything else. And so I read all the AA Big Book and I read all of the NA texts and I did all my homework in rehab. I was active. I mean, I did everything I was supposed to do to try to find a way to modify it such that it would work for me. But it was still challenging. And I was also afraid at times because they kept telling me I was going to fail. You will fail. You will fail. You will fail.
Mm-hmm. So we talked a little bit about this off air. A lot of my listeners are religious, and so they don't probably talk to a lot of atheists. So tell me, the atheism. Have you always been an atheist? Did you come from any sort of religious background?
I was brought up Catholic, Mary Beth O'Connor. Okay.
Right. I figured. Yeah.
And I mean, my family wasn't hyper religious. My grandparents were fairly religious, but my mother wasn't, and my stepfather wasn't. So we went to church, semi regularly. I actually was confirmed and made my first communion, but it wasn't a big part of my life. But if you would have asked me when I was younger if I believed in God, I would have said yes. But then when I was in high school, people started saying they were agnostic, and there were a lot of conversations around that. And so that I went to that. But by the time I got to college, I realized actually I just don't believe. I don't believe that there is a God. I don't believe in heaven and hell. And so it was just a sort of a gradual transition to realizing that's just not part of it's not part of my worldview.
Oh, interesting. And I'm just curious, how did you come to that? How did you come to that conclusion? Was there something that happened? Do you think it was because of what has happened to you, or was it just you looked at the information and said, I just don't think there's a God?
It wasn't anything that happened. It was really just looking at the arguments in favor of there being a God and not agreeing with those arguments and feeling like, no, I don't think there is. I mean, certainly there are natural, forces in the universe and things like that that impact us. But I didn't believe in an external being that was sort of, in charge or guiding things or even existed in any way, shape, or form. So it was really just that I didn't find those arguments convincing.
Got it. Okay. And so when you run into people who are religious, what do you think of the concept of, because I've met some atheists who are very antagonistic to even the idea of organized religion or a God. And then some were like, well, if that helps you as your muse to kind of like be a good person, that's great. How do you kind of view that?
I don't have any issues with what someone else believes as long as they're not trying to force them on someone else.
Sure.
That's really what happened in regard to the recovery thing, right? It's like today, I absolutely support 12-step recovery when it's the right fit for people. I mean,
Sure.
I support any version of recovery when it's the right fit. The problem comes when we tell people that basically, this is what worked for me, therefore it works for everybody, or even worse, it's the only thing that works. And in the recovery space, those last two statements are not true. And so you're always saying a falsehood if you say there's only one way, or it worked for me and therefore it will work for everyone. It's just not true. But at the same time, I do think that there's value in saying, here's what worked for me, here's why I think it worked for me, and I'm offering it to you like for your consideration. consideration, right? For your
Mm-hmm.
consideration. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sharing information for you to think about. But I always say, but there are other options. And I usually will tell people about, some of the other groups so that they know that they have choices and they can look them up and read about the philosophy and read about the meeting formats. And the other thing I'll say is in the recovery space, there is not a hard line between faith-based people and non-faith-based people in the peer
Mm-hmm.
support groups. There are atheists and agnostics that make 12-step work. And there are a lot of faith-based and spiritual people in the other alternatives to 12 steps because they like them for different reasons. Like, for example, Life Brings Secular Recovery is self-empowerment focused. So it's there isn't a hard line. All the religious people do 12 steps and all the non-religious do others. It's much more fluid than that. And there are a lot of different reasons why people choose what they choose.
Interesting. That's interesting. Now, on this topic before because I want to go on and talk about how your recovery went after, but before we go on, I'm curious. So, do you feel like having an atheism view of the world? Do you think that brings kind of more meaning to life for you, or do you think? I guess this is why I ask. Let me kind of preface it by saying this. I bet there are people who are listening who are religious. They're like, well, then what's the meaning of life, right? But sometimes I talk to some religious people, and it's almost like they are just spending their whole life preparing for the future of death and going to heaven. And I'm like, so you're just missing everything, right? As you're going. So sometimes I wonder, I'm like, if you were atheist, perhaps that would make you focus a lot more on the right now than some thing that's going to happen after death. Do you have you ever thought about whether that kind of brings more meaning to your life versus, or does it make you question like, well, what is the meaning if there is no God? You know what I mean?
Well, I say one thing. I mean, there are a lot of religious people who say being of service to their fellow humans is an important part of their religious faith, right? I mean, so hopefully they're not all just focused on, what's going to happen after death. But but you're right. I mean, for me, the value of life is really, or the purpose of life is really, and part of it is personal growth, right? That you want to sort of keep experiencing new things and stretching yourself and all that. But the other bigger part of it is really being part of your community. I mean, for me, for example, with sobriety, there's a lot of focus on the fact that I became a federal judge, and that was a real, that was an accomplishment. But it's not the most important part of my recovery. The most important part of my recovery is I'm able to be a good wife and a good aunt, and a good friend. And I'm able to, be of service to my community and help people out when they ask for my help or when they need my help. And I, give to organizations that I think are helping save the earth and have other good, worthy goals that I think are important. And so I view, my time here is to do what I can, or now I do a lot of speaking about substance use and recovery, and I try to reduce stigma. So I just want to have a positive impact on the people that I care about, but also on my broader community.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now going back, so you get out of rehab, you worked the 12-step program the best you could, and then ultimately, did you have any sort of relapse, or were you just clean as soon as you came out?
So perfect abstinence from day one happens, but it is a rarity. And so for me, I used 3 times in the first 5 months. And then I just had in January 30 years of continuous sobriety. And so,
Wow.
yeah, 30 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, but 3 times in 5 months, which, was much, much better, right? That was a lot of progress.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, so let me ask you then, when you had those times that you went, because I could imagine as somebody with an addictive personality or someone who has the issues you have, it'd be very defeating every time you did it. How did you get past that part?
I mean, I really viewed it as sort of part of the process. I was the last time was a big deal because I'd been home from rehab for a week, and my partner like caught me. I mean, this will tell you the chaos of addiction. Okay, so I wait until he goes to bed and I lay down with him, and then I get up and I start doing speed, and he's sleeping. Okay, and I'm using speed. I'm up in the dining room and he's asleep. the clock is ticking away, and I'm looking at the time and I think, you got to go lay down before he wakes up. You got to go lay down before he wakes up. I'm so friggin' obsessed and immersed in using the method. I cannot bring myself to go to bed to cover my own butt and not get, not having fun.
Right.
I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And so he gets up and he sees me at the dining room table and he knows exactly what's going on. And he legitimately, he's very upset. And that was the last time. That was the last time. But a lot of it is really, a lot of the reason people often don't have perfect abstinence is, first of all, getting to an abstinence commitment is often a process. Most people don't walk into recovery 100% either committed to abstinence or believing that they can be sober. I mean, I didn't really believe I could be sober. I was trying to figure out how to use less so that things were not as bad. So it took me a while to really start to see that that if I did the work, that maybe actually I could succeed. So it took a while to sort of get that concept in my mind. But also, sobriety is practice, right? It's really about building skills. And in the beginning, you don't always have the skills that you need. And so your brain also is still sort of caught in that loop, right? And with sober time, the loop gets softer and softer. And with sober time, your positive choices rewire your brain in a positive direction. So in the beginning, it's hard for all those reasons. You don't have the skills, your brain is pushing you to do it, and you're usually trying to figure out if it's even possible for you to stay sober.
Yeah. Did you ever tell anybody in rehab, you're like, look, I'm just here to figure out how to do it less so that doesn't mess up with my life?
It wasn't that I wanted to keep using. It was that that's the best I could imagine. Like that was as far as my imagination went, was maybe I can figure out how to use less. But it wasn't that I wanted to keep going. It wasn't until I saw other people that had succeeded, that had been as bad as I was, that I started to think, well, maybe if they can do it, maybe I can do it too. I mean, that is one of the benefits of going to peer support groups, is seeing the examples of the people who came before you, which can give you hope that that maybe you'll be able to succeed. And early recovery is hard. You need that hope. You need that hope that it's actually possible in order to do all that hard work.
Now, so when you get out, you have those 3 times in that first 5 months, and then you're clean. What is it that you the 12-step program didn't quite work for you? So what did ultimately kind of work for you?
So I will emphasize that when I got home from rehab, it is January of '94, and there was no Google. Okay, there's no Google. But I thought, is it true, that there's no other options? And so I got in my car and I drove to the library and I did the research.
Are those things even around anymore? I don't know.
I don't know about anymore. In '94, that's where I went. And it turned out that it actually wasn't true, that there weren't any other options. Even in '94, there were options, and there are many more options today. And so I found Women for Sobriety, which is the first modern peer support secular option. And they still exist. I actually speak at their conferences. I'm speaking at the next one in June. I also found Rational Recovery, which exists a little, but today mostly is Smart Recovery. And I found a secular organization for sobriety, which exists a little, but today is basically LifeRing Secular Recovery. And I'm on the board for LifeRing. And so what I did was the same thing I did with 12 Steps, which was I read all the books and I went to all the meetings, and I continued to sort of just filter everything for which of these strategies and techniques do I think will work for me, or do I think I should try to incorporate into my plan. And so I was always viewing, I try to be proactive. Even at 12-step meetings during the smoke break, if people were talking about like a technique they were using, I was listening, I was paying attention. But I was always filtering everything for, I view them all as sort of suggestions or ideas. And which of these ideas do I think that I can use? And so today LifeRing would call what I did building a personal recovery plan, but that terminology didn't exist in those days. But that's what I did. I tried to be open and proactively grabbing onto every idea I could find, and I built a plan that worked for me.
Wow, man. Now, as you're going through this, how long did it take for you to kind of start climbing back up the corporate ladder?
Yeah. So when I got home, so I had my Berkeley degree and actually good grades, but an embarrassing resume, right? I mean, an
Right.
embarrassing resume. But I also wasn't really ready for a professional job. So my first job when I got home from rehab was a part-time, low-level, temporary admin job.
Mm.
Because for me to get up and go to work on time, okay, and
Right.
stay all the hours I was supposed to be there and do a good job and go back the next day and the next and do the same thing. I was 32 years old and I had never done it in my life. Like
Mm.
I really needed to get the habit of that, the practice of it, you know? And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
that's what I did for 6 months. And then my
Mm.
second job was a permanent full-time mid-level administrative job. And then my third job was I got a job at a larger company as a supervisor where I got a promotion. And then at 6.5 years sober, I went to Berkeley Law for real.
Wow. Wow. Now, so as you're doing all of this, do you find yourself, well, you mentioned that you also were doing therapy
Mhm.
as well. Was it just standard talk therapy? I mean, I don't know how many therapies there were back in 94, but was it that kind of therapy?
Yeah, so I specifically looked for a therapist with trauma expertise, and she had a little
Mhm.
bit of addiction expertise, and that's what I went with. So I did individual therapy. It was basically a version of cognitive behavioral therapy,
Mhm.
and I was on anxiety medication. So for me, she correctly, but to my surprise, diagnosed me with, guess what, PTSD.
Yeah,
um,
right.
which for me showed up as very severe anxiety. And so
Mm.
I was really struggling. I mean, it was really, really bad. And so I was on meds for a while and I did individual therapy for about 3 years. And then she put me into group therapy with women who had trauma histories. And that was a
Mm.
friggin' eye opener. That was like
Mm.
a whole new level of recovery and understanding for me. And I was
Mhm.
in that group for about 5 years. It took
Mm.
me many years longer to get my trauma and my anxiety under pretty reasonable control than it did to get my substance use disorder under control. I really didn't struggle with my with drugs after or even the cravings or the thought of drugs after about 2.5 years, but it
Mm.
took me about 8 or 9 years to get to the point where my anxiety and my PTSD were even 80% improved. It was a much
Wow.
longer haul because it was older and it was more complicated. So that
Yeah.
was actually the longer process for me.
Wow. So, did you ever get to a point? Sometimes I wonder, you were dealing with a specific diagnosis, which is one thing. But I told him on one of my last podcasts, I was talking to a guy about he had some trauma in his life and he had done some EMDR therapy. And I said, if I wanted to, I bet even with people who are just emailing me wanting to come on this podcast, I bet I could fill the next year with mental health providers and behavioral coaches for people who want to come on these podcasts. There's so many of them. And I can't imagine that they're all doing great work. So, as someone who went through therapy and had a successful outcome, what do you think is something that makes a good therapist?
Yeah, and the other thing is my husband and I were, well, my now husband, not then, but we were in
Right.
couples counseling. And I will say our first couples therapist was terrible.
Yeah.
And so part of it, I think if you're looking for a therapist, one thing is to talk to them about their experience in the specific area you're looking for. And I don't mean necessarily what therapy philosophy they follow or technique. You
Mhm.
can do that. Look up CBT or DBT or EMDR didn't exist then. They probably would have done it for me.
Mhm.
But are they an expert in substance use disorder? Are they an expert in trauma? Are they an expert in adult child of alcoholic or whatever it is that you have, and make sure that they have experience in that area. And the other thing is that on one hand, I wouldn't want to reject a therapist after like one visit unless something really horrible happened. But they are a vendor in a way, right? You're
Right.
paying them. And so even if they're good overall, they're not always going to be the right fit for you. And
Yeah.
so make sure that you're sort of doing an honest assessment. Is this working for me? Am I
Mhm.
actually improving? Am I moving
Mhm.
forward? I will say my individual therapist, when I first met her, I wasn't confident because she was very hippy dippy, like, and I'm not a hippy dippy kind of person. I thought, I don't know about this, but she was actually very good for me because she was calm, but she was very focused and she was
Mm.
really paying attention. And And she really helped me release a lot of my thinking. And for me, a lot of it was challenging my thoughts and my fears, because I really had disproportionate fears and about what might happen or how things were going to go wrong. And I could spin and spin and spin. But I definitely think you are a consumer in a way of the therapy, and you need to make sure that it's working for you and that it's helping. And if it's not, it's okay, to cut and run.
Yeah. I think that that's true. And I think also in my experience with people who have is that there are some out there that, they love that check coming in. If you pay on time, they'll see you as long as you want. You know what I mean? And, not necessarily, giving you big returns. Were there any tools for your PTSD that you found to be super helpful?
One of them was definitely that I had to challenge my own thinking. And so I like my therapist, for example, one time told me that I could give a logical argument for pretty much anything, but it didn't mean it was true.
Right.
And so for me, what was the biggest problem was that I did not trust basically the world, right? And so I was always worried that if I made one little mistake, that everything was going to blow up. I was going to lose all that I had worked for, and it was going to explode in my face. I did not trust the outcomes, and I didn't. But what it took me years to realize was, in the long run, what I had to learn was bad things will happen. I can't be expecting the world to not have that in it. But what I had to learn to trust was that I would be able to handle it, whatever happened. And it doesn't mean handle it without pain or without stress or without, anguish, but it means that, yes, you will be able to get through it. You will be able to handle what's ever happening and move forward. And it took me a long time to realize that was actually what I needed to learn to do, versus just trying to be perfect and control everything and spin and obsess and go over the details. I mean, perfectionism and workaholism, for example, are often trauma responses for exactly that reason. You're trying to control everything so that nothing goes wrong.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I find it fascinating that you get out of substance abuse disorder and you're able to become clean, and then you enter law school in a field where more people have substance use issues than just about anyone other than dentists. And I don't know what's going on with dentists, but as far as like going into that. So law school at Berkeley, I got to imagine that was rough. How did you handle, now that you're not, you're only 6 years sober, you're still working through these anxieties and these mental health issues, this trauma. What coping mechanisms did you use to get you through that experience?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, it was helpful that I was older. So I was 39 when I started law school, and my husband and I were actually married by that point, and our relationship had really sort of settled in. Other than my anxiety spinning, we were doing well. So I had those advantages. I was in a calm household, and also I just did law school when I was in college. Like you, I worked part-time through college, but in law school, I only did law school during the school year. And so I structured it like a job. Like I got up at the same time every day, no matter what time class started for me that day. And I went in at the same time every day. And if I didn't have class, I was, in the library on the computer working. And I just tried to approach it in a systematic, way. And also I just always stayed ahead. I got myself ahead in the beginning of the semester, and I stayed ahead so that toward finals, I had time to review and do practice exams and all those other things. So I really, by then I was disciplined, right? I had discipline, and I was able to develop a plan and carry it out. And I was in a calm living situation, and that really helped me. But I still spun. I mean, my first semester grades, I was just sure that I had failed this one class. Oh, I remembered a mistake that I made on an exam. Okay, I remembered a mistake. Okay. But therefore, God knows what other mistakes I must have made. This is how my mind went. And I again ended up, and I got the second highest grade in the class, And so I still, part of what was sort of saying about it is that even when I was doing the right thing or having accomplishments, in the early years, I wasn't able to enjoy them sort of the way I deserved because of the anxiety. And so it took me a while, but I was doing the right thing. I just was also sometimes spinning.
That's funny. I remember you struck a memory. I remember going in for the bar, and the California bar exam was 3 days still.
Yeah.
Now it's 2. And I remember on the first day, one of my exams was a criminal law, typical Fourth and Fifth Amendment, issues. And I go through, and for whatever reason, the question, I just did not compute that they were talking about a Fifth Amendment issue, and I completely blew it. And like I did the Fourth Amendment analysis, and I even mentioned, I was like, well, there's a Fifth Amendment analysis to make, but there's nothing in this question that mentions it. And then I get outside, and one of my buddies is like, no, that was in the question. And I remember thinking to myself, I was like, I don't even know why I'm going to go back in there. It's like, that's it. It's over. You know what I mean? Like, I'm done. And I passed the first time, but I remember the whole rest of the time, I'm like, I'm just doing this for practice. Day after, I'm just going to start studying for February. It's so funny how you get that way. And so now you graduate. So what are you doing then? What did you start? What was your first job?
I went to a big law. I worked in big law in Silicon Valley, and I did complex business litigation and securities class actions primarily.
Did you find that you were now a workaholic instead of an alcoholic?
Yes.
You have to be for big law. You have to be.
But at my firm, you would get the ranking of where on hours of where you fell, like in litigation versus litigation would be one group and corporate would be another. And my first year, I think I was number 7 out of, I forget, 220 or something. And they were like, Mary Beth, your first year. You're not supposed to. But part of it was that I did good work until they kept giving me more. And I'm just not good about saying no. And I wanted to make a good impression. And I didn't think I was going to end up wanting to make a partner, but I wanted to be on partnership track unless and until I decided I wasn't, you know what I mean? I did work a lot of hours. I was always on the high end for hours. You're right. And then when I was there about 4 years, and I will say that it wasn't the work itself, it was the hours where at that point I was like, the thing is, it doesn't get better going forward, right? There's no light at the end of that tunnel. Partners work those same hours, if not more. And so I just decided that I didn't want to live that way. And I left and I went to do litigation for the federal government, which I still worked more than 40 hours. I was the highest in my office again, but it was less than when I was at the big firm. Right. So it was a little bit more balanced. So I kept trying to get better balance as time went by.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just talking to somebody, and we find here at our firm, because we work a lot, we've got a lot of hours, and it's just, this is the only law job I've ever had. Like I was a law clerk here. This was my first law job. They welcomed me, and I've stayed all the way through. I've been here 15 years, 12 as an attorney. And it was just so funny because laterals tend to have a real hard time coming here because the expectation in the hours just to do a good job here. That's what you have to do, right? It's not, nobody's watching you. We don't have billable hours, but at the same time, you have to have a good job. And so I remember people asking me like, how do you work so much? And I was like, I honestly just don't know any different. This is all I've done. You know what I mean? It's just, this is how it is. And it doesn't get better. I mean, it does. You get more efficient, but at the same time, it's funny. The reason I bring all this up is I remember when I became moved from law clerk to associate. Same thing. Like it's just the winners get more, right? And I was like, I feel like I ate a pie eating contest, and the award was just more pie, So now, and it's interesting that you're able to do that and maintain sobriety. Especially I imagine there was also, if you're working in big law, there were parties, there were networking events, things of that nature. And I'm sure there was alcohol, going on, and you were able to maintain all that.
mean, so this is the thing. There are some parts of the recovery community that talk as if you have to be hyper focused on your sobriety for the rest of your life. Like the same hyper focus you have on day one, you're going to have it at 20 or 30 years. That's not true for most of us. For most of us, as you know, you get it's those first early years, the first 2 years or 3 years where you really have to hyper prioritize what do I need to do for my sobriety? That's my number one priority. And you're doing a lot. But after that, for most people, it's just your way of life. It's just how I live. It's part of who I am. And part of that is why the data shows that people, once they hit 5 years of continuous sobriety, they have an 85% chance of never relapsing again. I mean, it's usually it's not that it can't happen, 15% is still not zero, but it's just part of your normal life. And part of that, and I really always emphasize this with newbies, is that we talk a lot about how substance use disorder rewires the brain, but the reality is that sobriety rewires the brain. Making positive choices over and over and over again, doing new positive habits like getting up and going to work every day on time, all those positive things, they rewire the brain too. And so it becomes your new normal. And so for me, after 2.5 years, I never struggled with substance use disorder again. I mean, my best friend died and it never occurred to me to pick up. And so I will say at a coolie party, though, one time I accidentally, a chocolate had alcohol in it, but it was an accident. So that's
That doesn't count. That doesn't count. Yeah. Well, so there's people probably listening to this who may have a loved one, family member, someone of that nature who is struggling with addiction. What is somebody who's now on the other side of this and helps others? What would you say are some important things that family members need to know to help?
So, that idea that we heard from the 90s and the aughts about tough love, cut people off, tell them you never talk to them again if they don't go to rehab now. That doesn't have very good data. It has actually pretty poor data. So today, the technique that's recommended for friends and family is called CRAFT. It's Community Reinforcement and Family Training. And there's a book that I always highly recommend to friends and family. It's called Beyond Addiction, and it's CRAFT based. It's based on CRAFT techniques. And there's also a workbook that came out about a year ago for Beyond Addiction. So in the Beyond Addiction book, for example, it explains, what is substance use disorder actually? What's the current definition? Like today we focus on continued use despite negative consequences, right? Significant negative consequences. But it's also about why is it so hard to stay sober in the beginning? And part of that is about, think about changing any habit, right? Trying to suddenly exercise 4 days a week can be a challenge. I mean, there's a process that you go through, and it explains those kind of things. It talks about the brain and the brain rewiring, but it also talks to friends and family about where they can have a positive impact and where they need to let go. So it talks about the positive reinforcement techniques that can actually have an impact on your loved one to help them move, forward towards either at least reducing their consumption, if not ultimately getting to sobriety. But it also talks about, here's what you can't control. And so, here's what you shouldn't. And part of that is that a lot of times friends and family want to decide for their person with the addiction, what treatment they should get or what program they should go to or all those things. And it's really important that the person with a substance use disorder makes those decisions. You can offer information and things, but they need to make it. So the book goes through those topics and many others, and it can really, I think, give a deep and broad understanding and actually concrete suggestions as to what friends and family can do.
Okay, interesting. So now, on top of that, also, if you're somebody who is in the midst of an addiction and struggling and wants to get out, but is in that place that you were in, right? Where like they don't see a way out realistically. How do you get, what would you recommend to change that mindset?
I'm going to say a couple of things. One is that today we really talk. When I got sober, they told us that like one day you cross the sort of invisible line from substance abuser to drug addict, which was the terminology. Then you didn't know what day it was, but one day you crossed it. But today, that's not how we view substance use disorder. Substance use disorder is, a mental health condition. It's in the DSM, the diagnostic manual. And it can be mild, moderate, or severe. It's on a spectrum. Just like you can have mild, moderate, or severe anxiety or mild, moderate, or severe depression. Same with substance use. So one of the current emphases is if you develop a substance use disorder, let's disrupt it at the mild or moderate level and not wait until it gets to the severe level.
Sure.
And so that's really part of the encouragement. In other words, that you have to hit some horrible rock bottom ideology is wrong, and it's dangerous because people die that way. And even if they survive, they lose a lot more years. But if somebody does end up at the severe level, and if I take that DSM test, I would have been at the very severe level. That's part of what Beyond Addiction talks about, is how you can use positive reinforcement to sort of gradually move them in a positive direction, but also how it's important to let them be heard. I mean, one of the things that people sometimes hesitate is to have a conversation about what are the drugs actually doing for you, right? What need are they serving? And can we find a different way to get that same need met that isn't having the negative consequences of the substance use? So there's a lot of techniques like that. If they reduce consumption, do a positive, oh, wow, I noticed you went to grandmom's birthday and you didn't drink there. I really appreciate that. Sort of trying to make them feel like it's okay to have a conversation and participate in it, and that they're not going to be slammed and judged and beaten up constantly. And so it's partly about keeping the loving relationship open and the door open. For the person herself, if I today, I would go in and try to get some kind of an evaluation. Because, for example, today, if someone is going in for substance use treatment, they should also be evaluated for other mental health conditions, because they should be treated together. So if somebody has PTSD or anxiety and a SUD, they should be both tackled from the beginning, because you're going to have better odds of success. But you can go to treatment centers or there are doctors or therapists with addiction expertise who can help you look at the options and see, do I need to go inpatient? Not everybody does. Or do I want to do an outpatient program? Or do I just want to do a therapist with addiction expertise? But there's also now medication for opioid use disorder, medication for alcohol use disorder, not for stimulants. So the whole world of what the treatments options are bigger, and there should be an individualized assessment as to which are going to be the best option.
Here's a kind of off the wall question, but someone who's gone successful through therapy. One of the things that's interesting, I understand the concept of the idea is, if you know why the behaviors are happening, you can identify the trauma that's causing the behaviors, then you can take the steps to modify the behaviors or change the behaviors. That's kind of the concept I understand. But what happened? Like, how do you get away from? Because I think if you go and you just hear the whys, it can at some point turn into kind of, if the behaviors continue, suddenly the trauma becomes an excuse. And you have been successful in limiting those things over a long period of time. How did you get from the part from where you're understanding why things are happening into implementation to change the behaviors, if that makes sense?
So I'll say a couple of things. One is, that's why the substance use disorder and, let's say, the trauma should be both attacked at once, not attack the trauma and then hope that the substance use disorder magically goes away, right? Because it probably won't. But also, the way I think about those connections is that I tried to do therapy when I was using, and I could make no progress because the drugs were like a wall between me and myself, right? So I couldn't access my emotions. I didn't really even know how to explain what had happened in an accurate way. And the other way I think about it is that it's hard to stay sober if your mental health is out of control, and it's really nearly impossible to get your mental health under control if you're not sober when you have a substance use disorder. So there's that. But the what was the other part of your question? There was
Well,
another
I was just wondering, so like with trauma, right? Like
Mhm.
trauma responses that come from PTSD. So, okay, you understand that you have certain anxieties and certain triggers that come because of your PTSD, and that PTSD comes from whatever traumatic experience it came from. Well, what I see sometimes in some of the people I know who have trauma is that the behavior doesn't necessarily change, and then when you bring it to their attention, they say, "Well, it's because I have trauma, I have
Mhm.
PTSD, I have anxiety, I have whatever." And the concept is you're supposed to understand, and then somehow that is going to help you then modify or change the behaviors and limit the response. How did you find you made the transition from, okay, now I know where the traumas are coming from. Here is now the steps. Did like your therapist give you tools to use, or did you kind of, okay, now I can understand, I can calm them down? How did that work for you?
So on the behavior side, that group therapy with women with trauma histories was really helpful to me because the other women who were sort of further along, and I had been an
Mhm.
individual for 3 years, they were further along in the recovery process than I was. They were connecting their current reactions and their current behaviors back to the trauma in a more direct way than I had been. And
Mm,
so, for example, I could be explosive. I mean, if I felt threatened or criticized, I could get verbally aggressive. I was really bad at listening.
mm.
And I didn't really understand. I just thought that was sort of like, who I was.
Yeah,
But they made me see, no, this actually a trauma response. You're getting aggressive because that's how you're fighting back. Like, there's a connection back to the trauma. Once I could see the connection, then I could start working on it. But even when I saw it, it wasn't like I could light switch it, right? It was
mm,
really about learning with practice, how to do better and better. So, like with my
mm,
mother, if I would be triggered because I felt like I was being criticized at work, let's say,
mm.
over time, it would take more, like I would be able to handle the lower intensity situations well. And then with practice, the medium intensity situations, and eventually I
Sure,
can handle the high intensity situations
sure.
well. So I had to see it. And then I had to think about what do I want to do about it. And then it really took repeated practice for me to be able to modify my behavior to the level that I wanted to.
Wow, interesting. Now, as a judge, I've heard some interesting things about because there's a criminal element that comes along with a lot of drug use, and we've criminalized it to a point where a lot of people who just need help end up in jail.
Yes.
And here in California, drug courts have kind of started to become a little more prevalent. I know they have a pretty strong one down in Fresno and a couple areas. What is your view of, I guess, as far as policies when dealing with drug use? What are some things as a judge that you think are more successful than what we're currently doing, or what we are
So
currently doing that's successful, rather?
yeah, not a lot.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's what I
so
figured.
for me, I personally support decriminalization for personal use, and there's a couple of reasons. One is that today we have 500,000 people in America in jail or prison just for possession, not for
Mhm,
any other related crime. Just
mhm,
pure possession. But the other thing is that our own government categorizes substance use disorder as a disease, and yet we
mm,
criminalize it, right? So there's a
mhm, mhm.
contradiction there.
Right.
And but on top of that, it costs 3 to 4 times as much to incarcerate someone as to treat. In other words, we could treat 3 or 4 people for the same amount of money that we incarcerate one. And right
Mm,
now, we do not have enough treatment available. We don't have treatment on demand. We don't have readily accessible, affordable treatment for many, many people in our society. So those dollars would be better spent on treatment than on incarceration. The other big factor for me is that we have a significant racial disparity in the way we enforce our drug laws. And
mm,
so people of color and whites use drugs at basically the same rates, but a person
mm,
of color is 3 or 4 or 5 times more likely to get charged, to get convicted. The sentences are longer. And so that to me undermines the legitimacy of the drug laws as well. So those are just a couple of the reasons that I do support decriminalization for personal use.
well, and And that's also such a hard thing because it's not only that people of color get higher sentences, but also they are more likely to get felony convictions, which
Yes,
then harder to get a job. You
right.
know, you come out of that, and then also, I don't know. I am like just the biggest sucker for trashy reality TV, and there's this show that ended up on Netflix called 60 Days In, where they would like send they were in order to try to find the like weird stuff that was going on in the prison, they would send in civilians masked as criminals, and they'd have them spend 60 days in the county jail. And they could get out at any time if they started having problems, but they were supposed to go in and they would record it and film it. And the prison system, like, no wonder people have such a hard time in there. I mean, just seeing some of the people go in there and say, I think it's easier to get drugs in there than it is to get them out on the street. And then on top of that, everybody's fighting and doing all these things. And if there's someone in there who's just because they had in their possession a little bit of cocaine or they have a drug problem, if you could get those people out of that circumstance and change a life, I think you'd want to do that.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's better for the individual, and it's better if you care about where your tax dollars should go, and it's better. Like,
Right.
for whatever reason, it's better.
Sure.
Yes, agreed. And I will say about some drug courts are good, but there's a wide variety of quality. And a lot of what drug courts or probation or parole requires is actually not evidence-based. And so, for example, they may require that they go to only 12-step meetings instead of allowing them to go to the other peer support groups, which the other groups are equally effective. There's studies that have shown that. And so that's a problem. But also, it mandates specific treatments that don't have strong evidence. And they often don't allow medication-assisted treatment. In fact, the Pennsylvania court system just had to settle with DOJ because they weren't allowing people to use medication for opiate use disorder, and that's an American Disabilities Act violation. And so drug courts, I mean, on one hand, it's better than jail, but the other problem with drug courts can be the lack of being realistic about the abstinence. If you require perfect abstinence and to keep to not have a parole violation or probation or to participate in drug court, you're setting most people up to fail, because most people, even despite their best efforts, are often not able to have perfect abstinence. So some drug courts are good, and actually I've heard good things about the one in Fresno, but not all of them are. So even drug court, we need to make sure that their policies and practices are evidence-based.
Yeah. Wow. Man. Well, let me ask you kind of that you obviously have some qualities that have, I mean, to be able to, even if you were just kind of partying and stuff on the weekends, like the fact that you were able to make it through high school with grades well enough to get to Berkeley while doing meth, and then also graduate Berkeley, including not just also doing drugs, but also going through a kidnapping and rape and a violent relationship, and then also get clean and go to a top 10 law school, and then also go into big law and become an administrative law judge. You have to have some sort of qualities that make you have the ability to do that. And what do you think those qualities are that you possess that make you successful where others maybe aren't?
Well, I will say that when I got sober, one of the techniques I used was thinking about who I had been originally. Like, who was I before the trauma and before the drugs, because I thought those sort of personality traits and attributes, some of them would be useful to me. Like, let's try to reconnect to those. And it was things like when I got sober, I remember I was cleaning out my file cabinet and I found my college transcripts, and I was afraid to open them because I thought maybe I didn't do as well as I remembered, because I had lost my connection to the part of myself that, was disciplined and worked half time and went to Berkeley and got good grades. I had lost that connection. But in my sobriety, I think a lot of it was related to those same those same techniques about being realistic about where I was and setting what's the right next goal. Like one of the things that I saw people run into trouble with in sobriety is trying to jump ahead too quickly. I mean, when I got sober, I was 32. I felt like, well, I had wasted my education. I had basically, pissed away my life. And there's this impulse to make up for lost time. But when I was writing my book and thinking back to it, I was reminded that one of the things that I did well was I was realistic about what I was ready to handle. And I set realistic goals and I moved forward step by step, but I was always persistent. Like I never stopped, it was always, what's the right next goal and how do I get there? I have this job now. What skills do I need for the next job? And so now I got to work on getting those skills so that then, a year and a half from now, I can get the next job. And so I was always planning ahead. What's next for me? What do I want? But also reevaluating. Like when I went to Big Law and leaving Big Law was a major decision for me. My mother was a secretary. My stepfather worked for the steel mill. I mean, I'm a blue collar girl and that's a lot of money. And so for me to walk away from it because I wanted to be happier.
Right. That's hard. When you come from a place where there's not money and you suddenly have a lot of it, it's hard to walk away from that.
It was hard, but I think a lot of it is just persistence. But on the other hand, I do tend to be a hard worker. I mean, I'm retired now and I am on the board for Life Brings Secular Recovery. I'm on the board for She Recovers Foundation. I'm on the advisory council for the Higher Calling Foundation. I wrote a book, my memoir, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. I've had op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, and the LA Times, and Recovery Today. And I speak at conferences and, television, radio, podcast. I do continuing legal ed training for lawyers. My husband says I have to look retirement up in the dictionary because I clearly do not know what it means, So part of it is just that I like to be challenged. I like to, have my brain activated. Even writing my book. I mean, I was an excellent legal writer, but writing a memoir is a whole different skill set. Yeah. And I like that, learning how to do something new, something that I didn't know how to do. And so there is just sort of a constant impulse for me to try new things and to stretch myself and to keep myself active and moving forward.
Yeah. It's funny as an attorney, I think that at least for me, I mean, I've been largely successful in my career and I tend to, things that I do tend to, for whatever reason, they tend to end up being, I tend to feel like I overachieve based on what I like my intelligence. You know what I mean? Like I guess what I'm saying is that like I am all hard work. I'm not particularly good at anything, but somehow everything I tend to overachieve on those things. And I just think that there's a part of that where there's a mindset there where it never occurs to me that I'm going to fail, right? I go, I'm going to make it work. You know what I mean? It's going to happen. And then I have failed. And you know what? I still had a great time, like figuring it out. But at the same time, I also have a little bit of an inferiority complex where whatever I do, it's never quite good enough. Like I'm never satisfied. So I go and I find more things like, it wasn't enough to be a partner at a law firm. I also have to be a podcaster. You know what I mean? And it was like, and I have like all these other things that I do all of the time to kind of fill that. Do you feel like you have some of that where it's like, I'm never satisfied with where I'm at?
I do like new challenges. I will say though, I mean, I am retired. What I'm doing now is part-time. I mean, I probably spend 20 to 25 hours a week on it. And I do view it as my time to be of service. I'm retired now. I can talk about everything openly without professional, ramifications to worry about. But part of it also for me is I am able to hyper concentrate. I remember in law school, there was an exam and, when you're on the laptop, they sit you every other seat and the row in front of you is the opposite of that. Sure. So I did at the end of the exam, I closed it and the person in front of me in the row, but one seat over, turns to me and she says, "I'm sorry about the IT guys." And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, that IT had to come over and work on my computer 3 times during the exam. And I said, "I never saw any IT guys." because apparently I was so like hyper focused on my work that I just didn't even notice what was going on around me. And so that is part of it. But I am better balanced now than I used to be. I have improved over time. But I like that stimulation, and I enjoy the new challenges, and hopefully, that's not going to stop.
Wow. Well, listen, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to wrap up that I ask everybody, and I think I'm going to know the answers, but sometimes I'm surprised. So we'll see. You've had a lot of success in your life. What would you say is the biggest success?
I really feel like my relationship with my husband is my biggest success, because I I didn't expect to be married, because I didn't know that happy marriages existed on earth. Like, like I didn't know. Okay. It was beyond my understanding. And but he is so different from me that it really took a lot working it out with him, understanding him, developing a relationship we were both happy with. That helped me heal in a lot of ways. And it was very rewarding, but it was also required me to be open to his needs and what he had to say, and to listen to his low key, not assertive, way of approaching things, and care about his feelings over mine, and negotiate in a non-aggressive way, right? All those other things, and be there for him. And to me, that relationship, it's not just that I have it, it's that it helped me gain skills that allows me to have better relationships with everybody else too. So that was a really big achievement for me. And it was hard for me because it wasn't something I had any experience with, even watching. And it required me to really modify a lot of my own behaviors.
Okay. That's interesting. It's funny how a lot of people do that. It has to do with relationships they're proud of. And so that's awesome. So, so what would you say is your biggest failure in life, and what did you learn from
I mean, it would have been nice if I got sober before 32.
it? Yeah, right.
That was a lot of my life.
I figured I knew where that was going. Yeah. So
that was a large part of my life. And it would have been nice if I would have gotten sober earlier. But the reality was I wasn't ready, and I didn't know how, and I didn't know how. And so, but and now when I look at 32, that doesn't seem old to me at all. But at the time I felt ancient, right? And I felt like there was only a little bit of life left, and it turns out there's a lot more life left than I anticipated. But it would have been nice to start dealing with my trauma, my addiction at a lot earlier point.
Yeah, it's funny. I a lot of the times I have a law clerk that works for me. I keep a staff, and one of the law clerks that I used to work for me was in law school, and she was talking to me about she felt she was so old because she was graduating at 28, in law school, and I was like, I didn't get done till I was 31, right? And I've had a beautiful career and done much better than I ever thought I could. It's never too late to change. And I think, you can look at that as like, man, I wish I would have done that. But the reality is I think you're going to you probably can help a lot more people by the fact that it took you so long. And then also not only that, but at the age of 39, went to Berkeley Law School, graduated, and had an amazing career after 15 years or so of heavy drug use. I mean, that is a story of success that I don't know if I've heard many like it.
Well, and I will say that, I mean, look, I am proud of that judge accomplishment. It was really like a cherry, on top of the sundae. But today I use that judge title really as an ear opener. I mean, I'm a former judge with 30 years of sobriety, and that helps people listen to me a little harder. And so I can use it to share information that I think is important. And so that's really what it's about for me at this point.
Yeah. So, and that's the thing I ask. The last question I always ask is, one day you're going to pass away, and there's going to be a funeral and a eulogy. And what do you hope someone says in your eulogy? But I think the question is really like, what is it that you want to be remembered for most?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully I will spend the rest of these years trying to work on stigma reduction, trying to educate people about what substance use is, offering recovery options, but also offering hope to those who are still struggling. I mean, I just spoke at a rehab last night, and one of the women had a meth history, and she was around almost 30 and feeling sort of like debilitated and failed, and seeing me that I had succeeded with a very similar history to her, that gives her that hope. So it's all those things. I just hope I can be sort of a reassurance to not only the person struggling, but their friends and family. That if your family member's in a bad place at 30, it doesn't mean they're not going to get sober, but also help to expand people's understanding about substance use and recovery.
Wow. So now if people wanted to find you,
Mm-hmm.
they wanted to find your book from Junkie to Judge, where do they look?
So the book is on Amazon and all the usual sites, and your bookstore can get it or has it. My website is junkietoJudge.com, and I have my op-eds there and a lot of other information, but also you can message me through my website. I answer every message that I get if I can ever be of use or service. And then I'm on Twitter, and I will say I do not argue on Twitter. What I do is I actually provide information. So I will post the new studies about substance use or articles for friends and family or opinion pieces and my recovery ideas. And I'm at Mary Beth O _. So if you're interested in that kind of information, please do follow me.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, this has been I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's always good to hear success stories, especially when it comes to addiction. I think your story was going to help a lot of people. And so I'm grateful that you came on my podcast and helped my listeners out. And for those who are listening, thanks for sticking with us. And, you can always subscribe. We still got more stuff coming up. I have an original American Gladiator coming up next, so that should be fun. It's always funny who I end up getting on here. So, but anyway, so follow Mary Beth O'Connor, and of course, follow the podcast and put comments in. If you're listening on YouTube, you can find us anywhere. And thanks again. And Mary Beth, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Good talking with you.